Before we start off, I'm sure most of you here have engaged with at least one multilateral environment agreement itself. Just in terms of an emotions check or a tone check, how many of you all feel currently frustrated with how the MEA process are happening across the world? Any show of hands? Are you all happy? I see very few hands. No? The question is, how many of you all here feel frustrated with how the current MEA processes are happening? We'll quickly get started. I'm Hemavati S. Shekhar from the Children and Youth Major Group to the UNEP. Thank you so much for joining us. Our session is titled Reforming the International Environment Governance Architecture. And after the opening, we wanted to start the year with a space that helps us zoom out, look at the bigger picture when we deep dive into thematic sessions later. Right now, today is about understanding how the current environment system works, where is it struggling, what kind of changes are needed for a future that is more fair, more coordinated, and more open to young people itself. The hope is that whatever we learn here today can be carried into the conversations around climate, biodiversity, oceans, pollutions, and other discussions that will follow over the next days. To open our session, I'm happy to invite my colleague Cuban to provide more context about the session.
Thank you for that, Hannah. Good morning, everybody. My name is Cuban, Head of Outreach and Partnerships at the Children and Youth Major Group to UNEP. We meet at a time where environmental crises are accelerating. This means climate impacts like extreme weather events, biodiversity loss, pollution in our air, water bodies, and soils, and acidification of our oceans. Yet, there is cause for hope, both in recent history and ongoing developments. The Montreal Ozone Protocol is the poster child for successful international cooperation, having led to a global reduction in ozone-depleting substances and a subsequent recovery of the ozone layer. At the same time, lower costs of renewable energy technologies are contributing to rapid grid decarbonization, increased electrification, and cleaner air across the world. We have made meaningful progress in the 10 years since the Paris Agreement, although, of course, much more remains to be done. For all these successes, it is clear that we operate within structures that are fragmented, siloed, and uneven. More than 300 multilateral environmental agreements work hard in their focused areas, but we are here to ask a bigger question. How do we move from separate streams of action to a system that is coherent, inclusive, and effective for a planet facing multiple crises? This question has gained increasing relevance and political momentum in the past few years, as showcased by the inclusion of the MEA Day as a permanent fixture of the UNEA agenda. This is accelerating with the ongoing YEA-3 reforms and cost-cutting measures. Today's discussion is thus not theoretical. It's part of a real and ongoing shift within the UN system. Processes like the Bern process and the Climate and SDG Synergies Initiative show that governments and institutions and the UN system recognize the need for stronger cooperation. The challenge now is to take these early discussions and pathways and turn them into a long-term architecture that works for the people and planet. And this, of course, is where we must be present, not as just observers, but as partners in reimagining what environmental governance looks like in 2030, 2040, 2050, and 2100. Over past UNEA sessions, we have seen youth representation grow stronger, fostering deeper collaboration between UNEP, MEA secretariats, other UN agencies, together with young people who bring insights, urgency, and a sense of global solidarity. Even in difficult geopolitical moments such as today's, young people have consistently pushed for greater ambition and greater coherence. And this, I think, tells us something quite important. Reform is not about institutions. It's also about who is invited to shape the future and who is entrusted with responsibility. We need a system that listens, a system that responds, and a system that reflects the realities and priorities of communities everywhere, those communities that you are here representing today. I want to thank our distinguished guests today for joining us and for sharing your experiences at the heart of multilateral environmental collaboration. We look forward to hearing your experiences and observations on what is working, what must change, and how we can together build governance that is more coherent and more just. With that, I invite our speakers to help begin this conversation with honesty, courage, and a shared commitment to a resilient future. Back to you, Hema.
Thank you so much, Cuban, for grounding us. Now we'll move on to the keynote reflections. We're incredibly privileged to have two amazing women here joining us who are also been working very closely with the environment governance system that we are talking about today. First, I would like to invite Professor Patricia, who's the director of the UNEP Law Division, to give her keynote remarks.
Good morning. I really would like to thank the Children and Youth Major Group for organizing this session and for inviting me to share some reflections on a topic that is of utmost importance for our futures, but especially for your future. And this is reform of the international environmental governance architecture, which should reflect the needs of youth, children, and future generations. Let me be clear. By mentioning these groups together, I am not conflating them. I am calling attention of the audience to the fact that these three have different interests, needs, and rights to be protected. And today, at the margins of the 7th UN Environment Assembly, we stand at a defining moment for our planet. The environmental crisis of climate change, nature, land, biodiversity loss, and pollution and waste are deeply interconnected. Yet our governance systems remain deeply fragmented. If we continue with business as usual, none of the environmentally related sustainable development goals will be achieved by 2030. And I would like to share three key messages along those lines. Firstly, while multilateral environmental agreements are essential, the current system is in need of reform. Since 1972, the foundational moment of the current era of environmental law, multilateral environmental agreements have formed the backbone of global environmental governance, providing critical frameworks to tackle the environmental challenges and to advance the 2030 agenda. However, the system is complex and siloed. Yet, environmental issues do not exist in isolation. Deforestation worsens climate impacts, chemical mismanagement degrades biodiversity, and ocean pollution affects human health. Yet, our governance architecture often treats these challenges separately. The latest findings of UNEP's flagship scientific report, the Global Environment Outlook, are sobering. Under the current policies, none of the environmental SDGs will be met by 2030. According to the annual report on the achievement of the SDGs, only 35% of targets with data are on track. Nearly half are moving too slowly, and 18% have regressed. My second message is that environmental degradation is not just an ecological issue. It undermines health, education, housing, and economic security. It affects systems flows and is degrading the health of the planet worldwide. Without doubt, we need urgent reform to make the system coherent and responsive. For these reasons, strengthening coherence and cooperation across multilateral environmental agreements is critical and provides a very great opportunity. Countries face real challenges in implementing the diversity of MEAs in a coordinated ways. Many agreements share overlapping objectives and obligations, but rather than looking at this as a burden, we should see it as an opportunity. By connecting the dots at the national level, integrated approaches that are cost-effective and mutually reinforcing can be adopted and mainstreamed. Integrated and systems-based approaches are fundamental in ensuring cost-effectiveness and successful implementation, planning, monitoring of the international environmental commitments. And this coherence helps us to track progress more accurately, accelerates SDG delivery, and ensures that actions on climate, biodiversity, land, and chemicals, among others, are mutually reinforcing and ultimately supportive of better decision-making across all fields. My third message is that any reform in both its process and outcomes must be inclusive. Youth should be engaged as co-creators and co-designers of the future. Whole of society approaches are essential here as they require policymakers, government, and others to look holistically at the life cycle of a policy or law and its implementation. And this is a concept that has found expression in many MEAs. Youth in particular bring the longest term stake and a strong demand for accountability, with 2.4 billion people aged between 10 and 29. Youth will live through consequences of the decisions we make today, yet they remain underrepresented in environmental governance. UNEP is working to change this. And key examples are what we have here, the Children and Youth Major Group, as well as youth-led processes like the YEA-3 Global Youth Declaration. But we must go further and do more. Youth can demand further action, help co-design more coherent systems, call for transparency, accountability, and innovate participatory models. Reforming governance means embedding justice, intergenerational equity, and the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment at its core. UNEP remains committed to supporting this work, including by facilitating dialogue among treaty bodies, promoting joint scientific assessments, and guiding harmonized national implementations. As I conclude, the message is clear. We need a governance system that is coherent, inclusive, and future-proof. This may require us to think outside of the box and to find solutions that the world urgently needs. And where better to find those than from among you young people? UNEP stands ready to work with all of you to accelerate progress towards 2030 agenda and the achievement of sustainable environmental commitments. Together, we can build an environmental architecture that delivers for people and planet today and for generations to come. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think a key takeaway, I think, for all of us to remember is that all issues that we speak about are interconnected, like she mentioned, but our governance is very fragmented in every way. So we need to look at all of these in the conversations we're going to be having later. Now I would like to welcome Ms. Maria, who's the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Ozone Secretariat.
Good day, and thank you very much for sacrificing your Saturday to be with us. So I'm standing here so you can see me a bit better. So as the moderator said, I am Maria Socorro Manguiat. I have the distinct privilege of being the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Montreal Protocol on Substances that Deplete the Ozone Layer, or borrowing the words of the author of a recent article on the ozone hole, the Montreal Protocol, the global agreement that actually worked. So before the Montreal Protocol, there was the Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer, whose 40th birthday we celebrate this year. The convention did not limit the production and consumption of the substances that are now controlled under the Montreal Protocol. However, it laid the foundations for scientific and technical cooperation to further investigate the impacts of human activity on the ozone layer and the adverse effects of ozone layer depletion on us and on the environment. In addition, it established a conference of the parties that would subsequently adopt the Montreal Protocol, the international agreement that led to the elimination of 99% of ozone-depleting substances, or ODSs. Under the protocol, 197 countries and the European Union have committed to cut and cease the production and consumption of ODSs and to slow down their production and consumption of hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs. These HFCs were brought in as ODS substitutes. However, while they do not damage the ozone layer, HFCs were later found to be contributing to climate change. The protocol started with small and achievable targets, subsequently strengthened based on developments in science and technology. It was amended 5 times to incrementally strengthen it. Such improvements were possible due to the design of a highly flexible instrument that allowed the tightening of controls as science evolved. Every 4 years, the parties to the protocol assess the protocol's control measures based on available scientific, environmental, technical, and economic information. These assessments have been the basis for the inclusion of more substances and the adoption of accelerated targets and tighter controls. This science-driven decision-making process has been complemented by an innovative legal mechanism known as an adjustment that enables parties to adapt and respond quickly. Sustained compliance by developing country parties with their reduction targets is ensured through the protocol's financial mechanism. The Multilateral Fund for the implementation of the Montreal Protocol funds projects for the development of country programs, phase-out management plans, and various complementary projects. Another factor contributing to the success of the protocol is its non-compliance procedure, which is designed as a facilitative and non-punitive mechanism. The protocol's implementation committee considers cases of failure to comply with obligations under the protocol with a view to securing an amicable solution. Thus, if you look at any decision declaring a party in non-compliance, you will see that the emphasis is on the submission of a compliance action plan that will ensure the party's prompt return to compliance. Another key pillar of the protocol are its 3 assessment panels, which provide independent and authoritative assessments, namely the Scientific Assessment Panel, the Environmental Effects Assessment Panel, and the Technology and Economic Assessment Panel. Any observer of the Montreal Protocol will realize how important these panels are in the international decision-making process. Now, before I end this quick snapshot of the protocol, allow me to quote from the article entitled NASA Confirms a Big Win for the Planet, 2025 Ozone Hole Among the Smallest in Decades. And I quote, "As someone who remembers learning about the ozone hole in school as an environmental disaster with no clear solution, watching the world come together to fix it remains one of the most hopeful examples of global cooperation we have. And perhaps more importantly, it proves something we rarely get confirmation of in environmental science. Global action works when we actually commit to it." Thank you and have a successful assembly.
Thank you so much, Maria. I think it is, it's a matter of hope looking at the Montreal Protocol that multilateralism works and we can continue working that way. And now we'll quickly move on to a panel with 2 amazing deputy permanent representatives, Astrid from Mexico and Oost from Netherlands. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm hoping to have more of a conversation with the both of you here, hoping that you can share your perspectives on, your work and engagement through your experience with various MEAs and UNEP here. Maybe to start off, from your experience, we have so many multilateral environment negotiations. What do you see as the most important reforms that are needed currently to make the international environment governance architecture itself more coherent and effective. Either one of you can start off, and then we can come back to you.
Good morning, everyone, and I really appreciate the invitation and, of course, the question. But I actually wanted to start with one question for you, and it's pretty much in line with the previous question. So, how many of you know about UN80? Please raise your hand. Okay. And how many of you know about the UN80 action plan? So I guess that this good number of people will give us a hint of what's going to happen in the environmental governance during the next couple of years. And this is exactly what I wanted to talk to you about. First, let me give a special thanks to the Children and Youth Major Group, to UNEP. It is truly an honor to share with you some reflections at this high-level segment. And we do have a purpose in this event. You kindly share with us that what we want from this is to build a youth perspective on what an equitable, coherent, future-oriented environmental system should look like. And I can also share with you that Mexico advocates for an intersectional perspective to all UN80 reforms, which is what we are talking about, that must be led by the Global South. That's what we believe, with a Global South perspective. The children and youth, women and girls, indigenous people, and local communities and CSOs, for example, must be heard and lead these conversations. This is for us the most important event of YEA-7. Let me inform you that Mexico is putting forward a draft resolution under Cluster D entitled Strengthening the Role of the UNEP Headquarters in Nairobi for one, effective multilateral governance in line with the UN80 reform and its action plan. This is what we believe is the most important task of current multilateralism, to be more ambitious, to be inclusive, diverse, effective, and close to the people. So one of the big objectives is to tackle fragmentation and dispersion of environmental meetings, MEAs, and multilateral environmental negotiations in general that will take place in any part of the world. And in this regard, we know that UNEP will conduct an assessment along with UNFCCC of current arrangements in order to make proposals on possible structural changes and program realignments according to the UN80 action plan issued by the Secretary General a couple of weeks ago. So in our resolution, we invite the MEAs in the framework of their capacities to transfer their secretariats or operations to Nairobi, to make the best use of the facilities that we already have here in Yunon, and also the great human capital in Kenya, especially you, the youth from the Global South. So this is how I wanted to start the conversation, and this is what we see from the UN80 initiative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Astrid. Do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, it already is. Karibu Kenya, for those that traveled all the way to Kenya. Let me, first of all, also provide a word of thanks to the organization, to UNEP, to the Children and Youth Major Group for making this possible. It's really amazing to see so many people in the room. I think I just heard it's the biggest Youth Environment Assembly ever. So I think that's a big compliment to all of you. Actually, I have to say, this room has never been as full in the time that I've spent in Nairobi. Even the balconies have people on them. Normally, when we are in day-to-day CPR meetings, it's just the member states, and we don't fill the room as you do. So a big compliment to all of you to making the effort and come here and take time out of your busy schedules to actually demand your place in environmental decision-making. I think it's worth a big compliment to you. And I also like the big questions that were put on the theme of this session. I mean, striving for a coherent, inclusive, effective environmental governance system. This is not an easy question to answer. It's actually a very complex one and a daunting one. And already acknowledging that you as youth take the time to address these important questions, which are very necessary to address, but again, not easy to answer. I think, again, it's a big compliment. You really demand your place in this room, you demand your place in environmental decision-making, and you demand your place or your voice to be included in decisions that will affect your future. So again, a big compliment to all of you. As I said, big questions, reforming international environmental governance architecture, it might be necessary. I think we have just heard some reflections from the previous speakers that spoke to the fragmentation of the current system, that integrated approaches and integrated planning are needed to ensure effective decisions taken at the multilateral level, to ensure that they can actually be operationalized and have a meaningful change on the ground. But again, we have to look back at what's already there in terms of MEAs, the multilateral environmental agreements, and their foundational documents, which are mostly treaties or conventions. I think these documents contain key elements that explain or that speak to the current issues that we nowadays face in environmental decision making. These treaties and conventions and documents were set up to address global challenges of a transboundary nature that no country can solve alone, right? That's why we are here in a multilateral setting. But then again, when we are engaging in multilateral fora, we need outcomes that speak to everyone's interest, right? Not one country can be preferred over another. So we need to have outcomes that speak to the concerns and needs and interests of all. And I think that is very neatly reflected in the concept of consensus-based decision-making. That is a great concept, which in Nairobi we like to call the Nairobi spirit. We try to take decisions as much as possible by consensus. And I think we have managed to do that already for more than 30, maybe 40 years, that all big decisions we take are actually taken by consensus. And that's the beauty of multilateralism, that we design solutions to global challenges that actually benefit us all and that everyone can also find their own interests reflected in. But nevertheless, this concept of consensus-based decision-making also poses a threat, especially in the current geopolitical situation that we find ourselves in. If all countries need to agree for a decision to be made, then also it means in practice that one country can block decisions from being taken, right? And that especially holds true for when new treaties or new documents or new internationally legally binding instruments are being established. I think that question of how we can change this practice, if we want to, is a very daunting one, to which I mostly don't have an answer. But nevertheless, thinking about how we can overcome this very practical challenge is worth reflecting upon, I think. And I promise, Madam Moderator, I won't be long. I will shortly give the floor back to you. But in that, I think it's important to reflect on what's still possible, right? Because for treaties to be changed and for the environmental decision-making processes laid out therein to be changed, again, we need consensus, which is not easy to find because countries that don't want these decisions to be taken by, for example, voting, will not agree to these foundational documents being changed, right? That's the practice. So then again, how can we look into what's already there and seek new possibilities, new opportunities? And I think that exactly is the reason why we're here today, that moments like this, with so many people gathered in one room for one common purpose, namely to demand change in environmental governance processes, send out a signal, right? And it shows that people are actually demanding these global challenges to be addressed in an effective and adequate manner. So I will end again with a compliment that this is really encouraging to see when we as member states find ourselves in the meeting rooms on a day-to-day basis. We're not always encouraged by what we say to each other, I must say. But then again, seeing so many youth participants in this room, again, also gives us, I think, some encouragement to really think twice of what we say in the microphone to each other and to make sure that we actually do this for a purpose, right? And that purpose is our shared future. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I think I also want to point out on the consensus process, something that I look at it positively, even if you're a country that is under-resourced, not financially capable, you still have a voice in the multilateral process. And that is also very, very important for us to consider while we navigate the reforms conversation. But coming down to your country's engagement across different MEAs, depending on each country's, what practical approaches do you think have worked in breaking these silos and strengthening coordinations? Because a lot of countries surely face difficulties with their commitments with so many MEAs. They want to engage on various issues, but every issue they engage at also turns into commitments for them nationally. So how do you think, we break silos and strengthen coordination? Especially what can others learn from as well? Astrid, do you want to go?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. And again, it's not an easy one. I think it all starts back home. To coordinate, for example, in a country as big as Mexico is a challenge per se. So more than 32 states will have to convene and give feedback to and respond to the MEAs. This is something that we do in Mexico City. So internal coordination among our states is essential. But when it comes to our response to our people, and when we work directly with MEAs, there are a lot of questions about synergies and two different concepts, like what's the meaning of synergies? Why are we talking about coordination and collaboration? And what's the difference between these two concepts? So what I have seen that works with UNEP, for example, is that these synergies are really translated into, for example, the science policy interface. When you have these outcomes, you communicate these outcomes as an MEA, and then you coordinate with UNEP. So it's not only about the knowledge products, it's about what these knowledge products will tell and will inform member states. This is just a quick example. But this is the conversation that we have all the time in the room, and just knows about it. It is what can synergies really do for us, and what can it really mean in the day-to-day work and in the work in the field. So this is what I can share with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And also thank you, Astrid, for pointing out that synergies angle. I think that's a very key one, and I will speak to it later as well. Maybe just to respond to the question directly, as you know, as Netherlands, we form part of the European Union. So oftentimes in these multilateral fora, we speak via the EU with one common voice as 27 member states. But behind that one single voice of the EU goes a whole different world of combining already the voices and interests of 27 member states, which sometimes takes even more time to bridge together and unify than the multilateral negotiations themselves, right? So I think what is key in the role of the Netherlands in that EU pre-phases of decision making, and then also in what we reflect as EU on the global stage, is that we try and make sure that everything we agreed to in these global fora is actually implementable at home, which means that before we go into the EU decision-making processes and then afterwards in the multilateral ones, we try to hold up the net, basically, of what interests are basically felt at home, which means we try to speak to civil society organizations, we try to speak to industry and economic sectors, we try to speak to scientific institutions, academia, to ensure that we have a well-informed debate internally of which position we want to take, and translate that into what's needed on the ground, and thus what we want to demand for in multilateral fora. So I think that's one aspect of the question, that when we go and settle out to engage in environmental decision-making in a multilateral setting, we need to actually know what we want it to solve, right? And then I come to the question of synergies. Like I noted it down before as well. This is a key aspect and a key dimension, I think, of environmental decision-making, because it was just mentioned by, I think, Madame Maria. You said we have more than 300 multilateral environmental agreements, which is a lot, right? That means that we have many global challenges that needs attention in a multilateral setting, but it also means that we have a lot of separate mechanisms that address one specific question in those multilateral settings. That might not always be the most efficient setup, because also challenges change and evolve. What we agreed on back in 1972 might not reflect the current challenges that we face. For a big part, they do, but new issues came up, right? So trying to seek how to best integrate and mingle basically what's already there with the new and upcoming challenges is key. And also making sure that we build up each other's strengths there. And when we take action in one fora, or when we take action on one specific issue, it would be great if it can be integrated with taking action on other issues as well. So again, that synergies dimension is key. And actually within the MEA system, we have one actor, or one body that actually speaks to this concern of enhancing synergies. And that is the Environmental Management Group, which is a UN body, basically, a UN group that combines and speaks to those integrated approaches. So when, for example, UNEP sets out to address environmental issues as such via one MEA secretariat, for example, it can speak via this environmental management group to other UN bodies to make sure that their approach is being heard by others and can then also be built upon by those other actors. So ensuring that there is a continuous flow of communication and information going already helps to make sure that those synergies that are potentially there can actually be leveraged. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And now we'll maybe come to your reflections on youth specifically. In term, Astrid, you also mentioned about the need for inclusiveness and participation. When we look at all stakeholders, especially youth, ensure there's one thing about participation. It can be just participation, but also ensuring that it is meaningful in every way is also another task at hand itself. So according to, both of you, what changes do you think are needed to make that participation more impactful rather than something that is symbolic? Joost, do you want to come in first this time?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And I think it's a really good question, and actually a key question that you can best answer, I think. But let me try and make an effort to do so. In my first intervention, I think I said focus on what's possible, right? We find ourselves in a certain setting in which certain things may be possible and certain things may be more challenging. But I think that is one thing that I continuously keep in mind when I talk about stakeholder engagement. Look for what's possible, because certain settings, they don't allow for stakeholders to be engaged, right? But still, there are certain niches in which you can actually have an impact and contribute to the processes. So that's the general framing. Look for what's possible. And then also, I think, Astrid, you already mentioned it, listen to the science. I think when you enter a conversation based on scientific evidence, you already have a foot in the door, right? You already know that your argument is backed up by validated and sound data. So your voice will be listened to because you can back it up with concrete evidence. Then looking into the question of the how, right? Which is always the most important question. We talk about the what, we talk about what's out there, but about how to actually make sure that stakeholders are engaged in a meaningful manner is still a challenging one to answer. There again, ensuring inclusivity and keeping your eyes on the ball, I think, are two key elements there. Because when you demand your position or your place and your seat at the table, you can be, how do you say, daunted or amazed by what's out there, right? but making sure that you find the processes and the elements and the ways to actually make a meaningful contribution is key therein. So, for example, within UNEP, you have the Children and Youth Major Group, right, which organized this session together with UNEP itself. That is one way to engage within our national delegation, and I think I can see them already sitting at the back of the room. We have youth delegates, hi there. In the Dutch delegation, we just make sure that our youth, our national youth, has a seat at the table and makes an integral part of our delegation to, in this case, UNEA. So that is one way. But also, again, assemblies like these that are built upon a more general assembly like UNEA, but then focus on engaging youth, engaging cities and regions, engaging indigenous people, engaging scientists. These are all meaningful ways in you can influence what's going on out there, right? One other example, which I am in the happy opportunity to be co-chairing together with Clive, the global coordinator of the Children and Youth Major Group, who should be sitting in this room also somewhere. We co-chaired a group of friends on enhanced stakeholder engagement in UNEP-led processes. And this group is an informal group in which stakeholders and member states come together. It was set up both by demand of stakeholders, but especially by demand of member states as well, to ensure that outside of the formal meetings that we have in UNEP processes, we actually have a space, we create a space, a forum for member states and stakeholders to come together and to exchange on common interests, on what's needed in formal decision-making processes, but to ensure that the interests that are out there are actually addressed. So again, just making sure that you demand these fora to be established is a way to ensure you contribute meaningfully to these processes. Thanks.
Thank you. My colleague already answered this question in a really brave way, but I'll also come back to the fact that there must be a difference between participation and real decision making. It's great that we can hear all major groups, but it's also important that us member states can bring all your insights and perspectives into the documents, into the resolutions. And what I was thinking could be done is to actually reflect the outcomes of all these meetings and all your, let's say, questions into a single document, or to try to always come up with an outcome, because these documents will be read by member states, and then it'll be easier for us to engage directly with you, first of all, and then to have this meaningful impact into our outcomes or intergovernmental outcomes. So this is one important part. And I was going to mention the group of friends that just leads. It was an initiative by Portugal, and we pretty much liked the fact that it was an informal group. Over there are frank conversations, so we invite you to also engage into this group. And the conversations are not only about UNEA. We talk about MEAs and other processes that happen around the globe, and this is where we want you. And maybe let me just finish by saying that we also have youth delegations in New York. We'll want to have them here in Nairobi. But one important part, and I'll come back to this, is that we give the UNEP headquarters a bigger voice into the global or average conversations regarding multilateral environmental agreements, but also multilateral governance. We do have the capacities here. We have the human resources. We are ready to engage here, and we have the representation from the Global South. So this is also a good opportunity to keep on engaging. And once again, maybe this is the last question, but thank you for the invitation, the commitment, and the talent. And we must work for you. Member states must work for you. So here we are to listen. Thank you.
Thank you so much both for your very honest remarks. I think those are the kind of conversations we need to have. And as much as this conversation is daunting and overwhelming, it's a start. And, that is how we start the processes. We'll have, if the keynote speakers are also okay, we can quickly open up the floor for some questions, if any. Is that okay? Do we have anybody from the floor?
Thank you so much. This was a really fascinating discussion. As you mentioned, you specifically, this question of reforming the international financial architecture is a really, really complex one. And I'm really curious in your view, and I address this question to all of the panelists, what is the key next step we can take to help lay out the pathway for reform in a really tangible way? Professionally, actually working climate finance, and I work in part on the reform of the international financial architecture. So I deal in part with those questions of structural reforms. And in the context of climate finance, we have this independent high-level expert group on climate finance, which is run under the auspices of G20. And it has been really instrumental in helping lay out that pathway for reform, including for proposing the roles that different actors in the multilateral and the financial architecture should play in reforming the whole system. So I'm really curious, what do you think that could look like in the context of reforming the MEA's architecture, and especially as we have a very relevant resolution on this year's agenda, I wonder how that could be captured within that resolution. So curious to hear your thoughts on how that pathway for reform could be specified and laid out. Thank you.
I'll go back. Thank you for the question to the current process, or let's say initiative that's taking place or that was born in New York. And we have the YEA-3. I know that this is the umbrella. We need to look to it from a global perspective, right? And in this case, I think that package 27 is an opportunity of the YEA-3 action plan to bring these concerns of climate finance into the conversation and to be frank about it, because this will involve UNEP, but it'll also involve UNFCCC. And in this specific case, I think that all MEAs should be looking at the reform as an opportunity to bring or to fix these, let's say, issues regarding finance for, let's say, development. So, or any type of financing mechanism or resource mobilization strategy. So that'll be one possibility.
Sorry, just to clarify the question briefly, it was not how to integrate finance in the MEA's reform, but more like how a similar pathway for the MEA's architecture reform could be laid out, similar to the process that we have in the context of climate finance, just because there is already an existing mechanism there that deals with that question of structural reform. I think in the context of the multilateral architecture reform, we don't really yet have a process in place, like an independent task force, for example, that is working on laying that out. So just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a really good question. I'm not an expert on climate finance, so you know more about that than me. But I think Astrid already addressed the YEA-3 dimension of this question, because I think it's an important one to highlight, that ultimately YEA-3 is more of a guideline, right? Ultimately, decisions that need to be taken concretely on the ground, as you say, if we want to reform certain structures or reform certain bodies or institutions, that decision to be taken is up to the governing body of that respective institution, right? So there, it would be worth it, I think, to explore the question of whether we can actually have an exploratory mechanism or process or discussion, at least, that addresses these questions internationally, right? And in an integrated manner, like, we come back to the question of synergies there. But if you have such a well-informed debate of what is actually needed, then you can start thinking about, okay, maybe we can start integrating the work of this body together with that entity. And then we can start thinking about the concrete questions that need to be addressed by the governing body of that specific entity, right? But again, this is ultimately a decision that needs to be taken by the governing bodies themselves.
Thank you so much for your response. Do we have anybody else? I'll come to you. We also had somebody over here. Okay, there's somebody sharing. Yes, over to you, please.
Thank you so much. So currently there is the UNET reform process and there is the Summit of the Future. So I was thinking that there could be a risk of a reformer agenda itself because there's a fragmentation. Because in New York, there's the United Nations General Assembly, and in Nairobi here we have the UNEA, who are all pursuing a parallel but kind of like a disconnected path for the synergy. So my question is that how can the environmental governance reform avoid duplication of the reform agenda itself among different forums? So who holds or should hold the pen or the gavel? Thank you.
Okay. Anybody interested in answering this again yet daunting question?
I think there's quite a lot of things happening at different spaces, and it's important not to create the walls amongst those things. Like when you talk about the Summit of the Future, I think it's probably the most important document that has been negotiated. And though it is not binding, it has elements that could actually push the environment agenda. And the idea is, I think you're many, youth are many, and you have time and you're many. So what you could actually do is begin identifying what are the nuggets in each of these documents and then prioritize which would be the most important ones as pathways to beginning to reform the international multilateral environmental governance infrastructure.
Thank you so much, Patricia. We will take 2 more questions. I know there are a lot of hands up. One person from here, and I don't know how to choose. There's so many hands. Yeah. We'll have. Yes, you. I'll take you there. I'm so sorry. We can get back to you guys later. Thank you all for the enthusiasm. We'll have you on.
So my question is that given that most of these resolutions are sponsored and presented by the member states, I want to take a step back and go back to the time when, if we want to get in touch with the representatives of the member states, usually we have found that it is very difficult. Different governments work in different ways, and we try all our methods to try to get in touch with them. Some methods work and some doesn't work. So in your personal experience, do you have few of the suggestions for us on how can we effectively reach out to them and how can we get in touch with them? And on the similar note, is it also possible, do you think, in a near future that CYMG or youth-led groups can also sponsor and propose any multilateral solutions or resolutions? Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you for the question. I think many speakers are happy to answer this question. It's a very good one, and also one that is not new, right? I think, as you already rightly pointed out, this continuous engagement and continuous line of communication needs to be established in order to be meaningfully engaged as any stakeholder, be it youth, be it scientists, be it anyone. I think I have 2 points. One, join a group of friends. As I already said earlier, this is an informal platform in which member states and stakeholders can engage. It meets every 1.5 months, basically, to specifically focus on questions within the UNEP realm, but also outside of that when we speak of UNEA and other processes that happen multilaterally. So very practically, make sure you are speaking to your constituency, basically, that is represented in that group of friends. And make sure that your voice is being reflected in what delegates say on the room. And that is a continuous stream of engagement, I would say. We have met also in person. It's mostly an online meeting, but we've also met in person, for example, during September's annual subcommittee. Also next week, we'll be having an informal gathering. So there you can at least meet people in person and ensure that you make the connections there. But then on the national level, and I think my esteemed youth delegates can also speak to this when you speak to them in the corridors, but self-organization here is, I think, critical because the more people you attract in your constituency, the bigger your voice, right? and the less easy your voice can be ignored or pushed away by actors that you want to speak to. So I think the more people you have and the more active your voice is being raised in a national setting, then suddenly you will find your way to your national governments or other governments outside of that.
Thank you so much. Anybody else on the... Yes, please, Astrid.
Yes, just to answer quickly to that one, I think that sometimes it's as easy as to send it as like sending an email. Sometimes, probably in your experience, that happened before, but it also depends on how the structure works within nation states. But this is true. It can happen in our case. And we'll try to incorporate as much as we can. We are a small delegation, but we do what we can during the open-ended. We'll be doing it. And the language that will help you to bring all your perspectives is something that we want to see there. Probably it has the fact that's not always there. It has to do with the fact that we're a small delegation, but it's an opportunity, right? And also, just to briefly answer to the other one, who's the pen holder of these processes and this reform, I think that you need to take a look at what UNEP is gonna issue on the assessment that was mandated by the Secretary General. Because there will be, this will be the guideline, and all processes will be involved into this, even UNFCCC and climate and climate finance. So if you have the opportunity to inform this process, that's not a member state's process. That's also a key opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll have that one last question. The more enthusiastic person, please come in.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I'm Nada. I'm from Egypt. So I have two questions, but I'll be very brief. So in most of your interventions, you were talking a little bit more about how young people could hold the task, or what young people could do in order for them to be heard. But I want to challenge that narrative a little bit and ask you what you could do to have them have the option to say what they want. So one thing that you mentioned is the idea of having youth delegates in the Dutch delegations, and that's very respectful. But here I wanted to ask you, how do you allow young people to not just be parrots to the positions of member states, but rather represent themselves and their opinions as young people? And then maybe if there's time to answer these questions, we talked a little bit more about the deficiencies of consensus. So can we look at mini-lateralism as an option or an alternative for pressing agendas, be it in the environmental space or in other geopolitical situations? Thank you.
Yes, I think one of those questions was addressed to me. Thank you. Very good question. And I always like questions that change the narrative. So kudos to you for doing it. I think, and I mean, my youth delegates can tell me the contrary if you want, but I think what we try to do with having youth delegates in our national delegation is to make sure that we are constantly reminded that what we do actually has an impact on people, right? They are there in the meeting room, in our informal conversations, in the preparatory phase leading into this YEA, to ensure that their interests and their view and their way of seeing things reminds us that we are not only in a governance space, but we are in a world, right? In a world that is encountering challenges that needs to be addressed in a holistic manner. And I think, as I said earlier, we incorporate the challenge or the voices of youth therein, but we also incorporate the voices of scientists, of academia, of other civil society organizations, of industry. And we need to, as a national delegation, speak to our national interests, right? And I think that is what we do. And this is an example of it, but it's not the only example. I'm not sure if it answers your question, but I hope at least it sets out that this is an across-the-board exercise, which is not only taking place in the meeting room via visible youth delegates, but also in the preparatory phase leading up to it, to make sure that what we say is actually well-informed and the position we take in these meeting rooms speaks to the interests of not only Joost, the tall guy from the Netherlands, but to actually much more people that go behind it, right? And your second question, if I understood it correctly, was about plurilateralism instead of multilateralism? Or more or less, okay. I think it's a very interesting question because, as you already pointed out, what we see happening currently in multilateral environmental processes is that oftentimes, well, sometimes we are, but oftentimes we're not able to find consensus and thereby take the decisions that are necessary to address global challenges. Then the question rises, what is the alternative? Is it plurilateral forms of governance whereby a group of willing and ambitious member states self-organize to join forces and set the rules that they demand or that they deem necessary? That's one option. But then, of course, you have the risk of this waterbed effect, right? That you have a certain, for example, type of economic activity that is not anymore allowed in its current form in the jurisdiction of those, I don't know, maybe 80 or 100 member states that self-organize and have this plurilateral form of governance. And then these industries move out to another place of the world where they still continue to cause challenges that those other member states try to address, right? So definitely it helps to solve part of the challenge, I think, but it's not a silver bullet. Also, plurilateral forms of governance have very intricate challenges that will then come to the fore again. So I think what I like about this question is that you think about what's possible. And as I said in my earlier intervention, I try to keep that frame in mind when I find myself in multilateral settings, that I always look for what's still possible, right? If A or B doesn't work, then I look for the C option, which may still be an option. But then again, also the C option might have its challenges and its complicated dimensions, which then need to be confronted. But already having that changing of narrative, having that clarity of thought to look for a different option is already step one.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're coming to the end of the session. Please bear with me for 5 more minutes because this session is not complete without the voices of youth. So we want to hear on reforms from 2 young people. First, we have Axel, who's been engaging with across Rio conventions. Axel, over to you for your thoughts.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the people of Kenya, to the CYMG, and to UNEP for hosting us today. I at least feel very welcome. So as Hema said, my name is Axel. I've been involved in several different multilateral environmental agreements since 2021, including UNFCCC and the CBD. And basically, I have 3 main points in terms of how to approach this. The first thing is scientifically, different crises are interconnected. So Natalia mentioned the concept of planetary boundaries, that we have transgressed 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries. As a researcher on this topic, I also know that these are strongly interconnected. So both transgressing one planetary boundary leads to a high risk of transgressing others, but also in the reverse, solving for one can help solve for the others. So really we need joint solutions to these multiple different crises, whether it's pollution, climate change, biodiversity loss, or other environmental or social crises. The second key point I want to make is that we are, for better or worse, stuck with the current system for a while. And to navigate when these negotiations are happening in silos, it is important to build partnerships across constituencies. So one concrete example of this is that the constituencies for the biodiversity, climate, and land conventions of the UN came together for a joint position, joint submission on the topic of synergies between the different conventions, as one of the only examples of either countries or other major groups doing so. So really coming together across constituencies to show that we have a common agenda, we are dealing with these issues together is important. And as young people, we can take the lead on that. And the third and final key point I want to make is that for the future, let's be wild in our imagination. Let's imagine a system which actually represents the interests of both human and non-human parties in an effective way. Today, it is very clear that the way of making decisions is unjust when there are high financial barriers, when the countries that are the most affected often don't even have an equitable voice in the rooms. So this is a strong call to let's be bold. Let's reimagine how can a system that actually represents all different interests be made, whether it is to ensure that the most vulnerable are present and making sure that all voices are taken into account. So those are my 3 key points. Number 1, interconnected crises require joint solutions. Number 2, within this current system, we need to build partnerships across constituencies. And number 3, let's reimagine a system that we actually want. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Axel. Now we have Jana coming in, requesting you to keep it short, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the speakers for the interventions and the discussion on a very important topic that's taking place in a lot of other forums as well. I think from the perspective of the Chemicals, Waste and Pollution Working Group under CYMG, this is something that we are also trying to figure out in terms of synergies across the chemicals, waste and pollution space. And when reflecting on the title of reform, the thing that comes out is there's a gap in implementation of conventions and of targets. And this is where there is a call for reform to support countries at a national level, but also at a regional level to implement conventions and targets to protect the planet and also people's health and well-being. In the chemicals, waste and pollution space, there's actually been some interesting evolutions that have occurred and that can actually hopefully help with this reform in the multilateral space. And that being firstly evidence and secondly targets. When it comes to evidence, UNEA has actually supported in the creation of a new science policy panel for chemicals, waste and pollution. And this is incredible because now there is going to be scientists, policymakers coming together to speak about chemicals, waste and pollution, which has not been in existence. It was in existence for climate change and biodiversity, but not for chemicals. So this is something that is new in the architecture, a new building block, let's say, that can help to bring different challenges together in this space. And secondly, targets, there's also a global framework on chemicals that has 28 targets. And within that, there is also opportunity to synergize across different agreements. Thirdly, which is something I think that countries are trying to move towards, is more cooperation regionally. And this is something that the Global Framework on Chemicals actually supports in its objectives. And even just reflecting in the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment that happened earlier in the summer, there was a resolution to support the African region to figure out priorities when it comes to strengthening the sound management of chemicals and waste. So these are the 3 things that we are really hoping to promote further in the chemicals, waste and pollution space: is increased evidence, targets and regionalization, and all 3 inclusive of youth, because the chemical space, whether it's legacy pollution or existing pollution, is something that we will be inheriting. And so it's critical for us to be a part of the science policy panels as well as implementation of targets. And this is something that CYMG is constantly advocating for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jana. I know we're running late. I'm going to give a very daunting task to Aishwarya to wrap us up in the next 30 seconds. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, I believe this was a great start to the Youth Environment Assembly, and I believe that a lot of daunting questions were answered in this room today. Patricia, thank you so much for joining us today and encouraging the youth in this room to ask for more. I believe that the platforms like the Youth Environment Assembly is just a stepping stone for us to ensure that equity and intergenerational justice is embedded into all processes and parts of the system. Maria, thank you so much for being with us today and giving us an insight of how the Montreal Protocol works and how it's able to achieve its ambitious targets. But apart from that, I believe you also gave us hope in the fact that this system is actually working towards its targets and all our efforts is not going in vain. Astrid and Host, thank you so much for being with us today and being the biggest cheerleaders of the youth that we have seen so far. Not only in terms of the insights that you bring to this room, but also in terms of the concrete actions that the both of you have taken till date to involve children and youth and other stakeholders in all processes and the work that you've been doing so far. Last but definitely not the least, Axel and Jana, thank you so much for bringing your experience to this floor. I believe that your voices and perspectives are just the echo of the voice of all of the youth in this room. With that, I believe we can conclude the first session of the Youth Environment Assembly. Looking forward to seeing all of you in the subsequent sessions over the next 2 days.
Well, that was a fantastic session. Quick housekeeping on lunch break now. We're going to reconvene at 1:45 for one session on the financing future at CR1 and environment migration nexus that is going to be happening at CR3 itself. There's going to be a long queue, so try to navigate the chaos a little bit, but also try and come back for the next sessions to engage there. Thank you all so much.